Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Hamilton. I am an anthropologist, and I'm based at the VA Greater Los Angeles at the Center for the Study of Healthcare Innovation, Implementation, and Policy. And I'm also a professor in the UCLA Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity today to talk with you briefly about qualitative and mixed methods in dissemination and implementation research. I do want to note that the views I will express today do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the Department of Veterans Affairs or the United States government. So what we're going to focus on today in our brief time together is really what relevance mixed methods has to dissemination, implementation, or D&I research, and particularly what relevance qualitative methods have to D&I research. I'll talk briefly about the use of qualitative methods in D&I research, and then we'll get into some definitions and design options related to mixed methods, implementation evaluations in particular. And we'll think briefly about the use of evaluation data across different study designs and some methods decision making. So thinking about what methods might work and fit well within the mixed methods implementation evaluation component of D&I research. I'll talk briefly about collecting qualitative data and then share just a few thoughts about analyzing qualitative data. Obviously, these are all very big topics that warrant many hours of discussion, but we will cover the bases just so we can orient to the role of mixed methods and qualitative methods in D&I research. So let's start by talking about why mixed methods even matter for D&I research. We know that D&I research is very action-oriented, and we need methods that really help us to understand what's going on with change, what's going on with action, what's going on with practices that might be changing, and we need multiple methods to be able to figure out what's happening, why it's happening, and how it's happening. We also have a pragmatic need in D&I research to characterize and describe many different facets of what we need to understand in these efforts. So, for example, we need to understand the settings where implementation is happening. And within those settings, we need to understand people and relationships and who is relevant to what's going on and what their relevance is, what their stake is in what's happening with implementation. We want to understand the context and climates in which implementation occurs because we know that these are critical for understanding whether implementation is successful and what characteristics go into that success or perhaps, lack of success if that's the case. We want to understand the process that occurs during the course of implementation, so how and why a practice might be working or not working, how it would need to be adapted or tailored or adjusted, and what are people's perceptions of those processes, because we know that perceptions have quite a bit to do with what happens in implementation. We also need to be able to describe and characterize the strategies that support implementation, and, there's been increasing focus on what strategies are we using when and why? When do we make changes to our implementation strategies? And we really need mixed methods to help us understand those decisions and what happens when those changes are made. Furthermore, we need to be able to characterize the relationship between what we think will happen or our theorized changes and what actually happens. And mixed methods are, again, very well suited to help us understand those complex and dynamic relationships between theorized and actual changes. Qualitative methods have become really critical to dissemination implementation research. I did a quick back of envelope look at PubMed just to see how many hits there were for qualitative and implementation. Just those two words together, very simple. When I looked at it from the early stages of implementation science, late 90s to 2009, there were just about 1,700 citations. And then when I looked at the next decade in this very rough peek into PubMed, there were almost 13,000. So clearly there is a huge jump in the intersection between qualitative and implementation. And that's, of course, great news for people who do qualitative work and are qualitative methodologists. And really what qualitative research offers us in the context of D&I research is that ability to understand human experience, perceptions, motivations, intentions, and behaviors. These are all critical to our understanding of implementation processes and outcomes. And we also have methods within qualitative work that gives us a good way to understand on the ground what people are doing, what's happening in institutions in real time and space. So using things like observational methods, which I'll talk about shortly, that really help us understand what's happening with what we're trying to change, how is that impacting other aspects of the organization, how is that impacting people, and qualitative methods are really well suited to ask those questions. There are a lot of issues that we're trying to understand with implementation processes. So we've talked already about the importance of understanding people's engagement with one another. How are they interacting in relation to an intervention, program, practice, policy? And sometimes we can't measure that, or we can measure it, but we also need additional information that would be provided by qualitative methods. We also need to understand people's experiences of processes. We know that experiences vary, and so we need people to tell us in their own words what they think about what's happening. And that can really help us as the D&I researchers to know what to do next. We may think that things should be going a certain way, but then we talk to people and we hear that they are perceiving it differently, and that can help us know where to go. We also know that implementation processes, as other processes too, are very fluid and very dynamic, and they're constantly changing. And this can be really hard to capture on a scale. So qualitative methods are well suited to help us understand fluid and dynamic processes, and also the perceptions related to those processes and the outcomes associated with those processes. I had an opportunity to work with a group. We called ourselves QUERI, or Qualitative Research and Implementation Science, a few years ago, a group of anthropologists and qualitative methodologists who have been doing a lot of D&I research. And we set ourselves to the task of trying to figure out how qualitative methods are used differently in D&I research, and came up with a few key points that we described in the white paper referenced below. Started to think about and observe in our own work is that, especially as anthropologists, maybe trained in more constructivist theories, trained in a more inductive approach. What we started to see with this type of work is that it can tend to be, from a qualitative perspective, more along the positivist side of the spectrum, a little bit more deductive in nature, because oftentimes, or usually most of the time, we are guiding our methods decision-making in qualitative methods by the use of theories, models, and frameworks. So we're starting from a place of construct and designing our studies accordingly. We're also doing work that tends to be highly practical and targeted. So we're, with our qualitative methods, often explaining specific implementation-related phenomena. We're doing this work in a multidisciplinary fashion. So instead of being in our own disciplines, we are working with others who bring different expertise to the table. And this point is going to come up again as we talk about mixed methods, because this is also really relevant to mixed methods. Typically, our implementation evaluations are mixed methods, and this helps to strengthen our findings. And we really need multiple ways of understanding what's going on in D&I research in order to capture the full range of processes and outcomes. This is hard work, and we don't want to do it alone. We want to do it with teams. And so maybe perhaps different than days of being solo researchers, solo ethnographers, for example, we're typically doing this work as teams, and that has a lot of implications for how we set things up, what we do in our design, and our actual execution of the evaluation. Instead of spending a really extensive period of time in the field, what we often are in the situation of with implementation research is that data collection is time limited. It might be that we're collecting data at punctuated time points, for example, at pre, mid, and post implementation. And there's often, depending on your design, a rapid turnaround of results and potentially an application of those results, which I'll talk about shortly. You may have heard in D&I research that we think a lot about stakeholders. These are people who truly have something at stake in implementation, and they may be at multiple levels of the organization, and we really want to engage those multiple stakeholders and also collect data from them. So we may, in that sense, be more targeted toward particular individuals who play a critical role in implementation, rather than taking a more kind of long-term, in-depth engagement. This is not to say that the latter is not possible, but just typically in this work, we're a little bit more targeted in our sampling approaches. Similarly, we may be more targeted in our data analytic approaches because we start with a lot of a priori research questions, and we're often trying to integrate our qualitative and quantitative analyses. This may be different for those who are trained in a more phenomenological orientation, an orientation that emphasizes reflexivity. It just may feel different and be experienced differently to conduct data analyses that are more deductive in nature. And finally, another area that we felt was pretty different in our use of qualitative methods in implementation science was what we're trying to produce. So, of course, we're all interested, if we're academics, we're interested in producing papers, publications, and so forth. But many of the findings that we generate in D&I research and in our implementation evaluations are other types of products, like reports and briefs that we want to share with policy and operations partners. Maybe we're doing workshops or generating online resources like toolkits. In a lot of my work, we generate site profiles and implementation metrics, so really practical types of products that may be more relevant and accessible to practitioners. So it means that our emphasis is not always on that academic product, or the academic products might come later in our priorities. Let's talk really briefly about mixed methods. Again, a very big topic about which there have been, thousands of papers written. We're just going to sort of get a little overview here of mixed methods and talk about their implications for D&I research. When we think about mixed methods, this is a really helpful definition from the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, which characterizes mixed methods as research in which the investigator collects and analyzes data, integrates the findings, and draws inferences using both qualitative and quantitative approaches or methods in a single study or program of inquiry. Now, you may have heard and have been confused, possibly, by this idea of integrated mixed methods. The idea with mixed methods, especially in how we use them in D&I research and other types of health services research, is that it's not just about collecting quantitative and qualitative data in parallel. It's more than mixing the methods. It's actually attempting to integrate them in an intentional fashion. Cresswell defines integrated mixed methods. It really is that intentional collection of both types of data and combining them in terms of their strengths in order to answer your research questions. There's this explicit relationship between the qualitative and quantitative components in such a way, according to this paper by Woolley, that the results are mutually illuminating and producing findings that are greater than the sum of the parts. Basically, there's something that happens that intentionally integrating quantitative and qualitative methods that brings us to a better understanding and a greater understanding than we might have achieved if we only relied on one set of methods or another. Now, there are lots of different design options for your mixed method studies, but let's just talk, before we get into design, let's just talk really briefly about rationales. Why would we even be motivated to use mixed methods? Because mixed methods are difficult. We often don't possess in any one person the ability to handle everything that's necessary in a given method. So that interdisciplinary work, the time that it takes to do integrated mixed methods, it's a lot of work and it can be challenging. So we really want to be clear on why we're doing it. We want to have a rationale. We want to have a motivation or a set of motivations for taking on this difficult but extremely rewarding work. One rationale or motivation might be to produce sequential contributions. This is where you're using the results from one method to contribute to the needs of another. You might also be interested, and this may be in the same study, in producing convergent findings across different methods. You're asking the same research question, but you're using methods for their different strengths and ideally bringing them together to look at potential convergence of results. And it could be that you're using mixed methods to produce additional coverage. This is where you're matching the strengths of each method to a specific purpose, and each method is kind of handling a separate part of the overall research question that you're addressing. Now, as I mentioned, there are several different designs. It could be that you are starting with quantitative work and then moving into qualitative work in a phased approach. This would be considered an explanatory sequential design. It could be that you're moving conversely from qualitative work into quantitative, and that's an exploratory sequential design. You might be doing both quantitative and qualitative work at the same time, and this is called a convergent parallel design or a concurrent design, where there could be equal emphasis or importance for both sets of methods. And then there are many different advanced designs, which we don't have time to get into today, but it might mean that you're using more than one approach to how you're collecting the data in one study. There are lots of different considerations for designing and setting up your mixed methods research in your D&I implementation evaluation, and many of these issues come to very foundational levels of philosophy and theory. People coming together from different disciplines may have very different ideas about how we study what's going on. How do we evaluate it? How do we measure it? How do we assess it? And that can be a very exciting meeting place for teams, but it is important to acknowledge that people will be coming from different paradigms and ways of thinking about how we do research in a very fundamental way. Resources are a very real aspect of conducting this type of research, thinking about time, financial resources, skills, the team that you need, and really that problem. What is that problem and what are the reasons why you're using mixed methods? Getting back to those rationales, really having a strong case and a very explicit case for why you're using mixed methods. Lots of other issues here in terms of timelines and sampling schemes and how you're going to decide what methods to use. And there are really outstanding resources available to help guide your decision-making with this. I think the key point that I would make here is that you really want to think in integrated mixed methods work about your plan for integrating findings early. As you see here, we really need to think up front about the degree and the way in which you intend for your quantitative and qualitative measures and other data collection approaches to overlap or diverge. You need to think about, or very early on, how you're going to try to achieve that integrated mixed methods analysis during the course of your study, thinking about issues of congruence in measures or how you're setting up your data collection to achieve complementarity or expansion. In terms of how and when you'll use your mixed methods evaluation data, now, it all depends on your design, and there are some excellent TIDIRC resources that can walk you through design decision-making. What I just want to touch on here is that your use of your evaluation data will differ, not only depending on your design, but also on your theory model or framework. In process evaluation, usually what we see is an evaluation of what is happening during the process of implementation, but you may not be using that data in real time during the course of the study. So you may do a process evaluation in the context of, for example, a hybrid type 1 study that is mostly focused on effectiveness. In contrast, with formative evaluation, you may be using the data in real time during the course of implementation to actually make changes to implementation or to intervention or to intervention processes. And we see this application of evaluation data oftentimes in the hybrid type 2 and type 3 designs where we really want to use that formative information to inform what's going on during implementation. Summative evaluation might also be a part of your design, and this is often focused on the impact, assessing the impact of patient strategy, understanding the impacts of those strategies on processes of care, and it may be that in your summative evaluation, you're also looking at cost issues. So if implementation-focused formative evaluation, this would occur during implementation of a project plan, and it may look at differences between what you plan to do and what's actually happening. In this type of evaluation, we're often looking at adaptations, we might be looking at barriers to implementation, and we might be looking at adjustments that we need to make to our strategies in order to maximize the potential for success or our ability to achieve the desired implementation outcomes. A progress-focused formative evaluation may occur during implementation of the plan, but it's more often than not a little bit more quantitative in nature, and it might be oriented toward monitoring impacts and indicators of progress. So now this is not an exhaustive list of what you will measure or assess in your implementation evaluation, and it's very important to say first and foremost here that the constructs that you are interested in is very much informed by the theory, model, or framework that you have selected. These are examples of practice or intervention-related characteristics, contextual factors, and factors related to people that we know are absolutely relevant to implementation. But again, there may be other domains and constructs that you want to assess, but oftentimes we're looking at these buckets of characteristics or domains in our implementation evaluations. Now, choosing your mixed methods, again, a big topic of conversation, but just I wanted to provide some guidelines here for thinking about how am I going about selecting methods. You do want to think about issues of complexity, and there are very pragmatic concerns related to complexity, as I've mentioned, in terms of resources, time, expertise, and so forth. And it may be that you are putting some parameters around the types of data you're collecting and from whom you're collecting it in terms of your key stakeholders. It's also really important, and I'll give you an example in a minute, to think about when you're going to use which methods. So even though your evaluation might be overall a mixed methods evaluation, doesn't mean that you're collecting all types of data all at the same time. And we want to think carefully about how much data we need and how often we'll collect data, and really of great importance in integrated mixed methods, how and when we're going to use the data, how and when we're going to mix the data. Very similar issues here in terms of choosing your qualitative methods. Similar issues, but just kind of honing in on the qualitative component of your work. Again, thinking about what methods do you want to use when, and how much data do you actually need. We tend to often collect more data than we need and more data than we'll use, and that can become a little overwhelming. This table just gives you an example of how we set up our implementation evaluation in the Empower query funded by VA Quality Enhancement Research Initiative. In the blue, you see the qualitative methods that we're using in each phase of the Replicating Effective Programs framework, which was our implementation strategy and also our framework for designing our evaluation. So you see all of the blue aspects of our qualitative data collection. I'll describe a couple of these, as well as quantitative data collection that occurred during preconditions and during implementation. I don't need to get into the details of this, but I just wanted to provide an example of how we designed our qualitative methods to indicate what methods we were using. That's in purple. When we the data, that's in red. Who we were collecting the data from, that's in green, and what domains were recovered with each method that we chose, that's in blue. And this is described further in our protocol paper. I didn't think this talk would be complete without touching just really briefly on thinking about data collection. Really briefly touch on data collection via interviews and via semi-structured interview guides, and also a little bit about ethnography, because it really is a growing area of interest and activity in implementation evaluation. Clearly, there's a lot to say about designing an interview guide, but just to give you some guideposts for thinking about this particular form of data collection. What we're doing often in our implementation evaluations is, in a semi-structured fashion, really honing in on the key topics of inquiry and thinking about how and whether those topics differ by stakeholder group. For example, are you asking different questions of patients and providers? And if so, why? In the mixed method study, the more convergence you have across your data collection efforts, the more opportunities you're giving yourself for those integrated mixed methods analyses. You also want to think about how the questions map to the theory, model, or frameworks that you've selected. And in mixed methods, how, when, and where do your questions actually align with your quantitative data collection? And here we want to go back to those principles of convergence, expansion, and complementarity. And you may be drawing on more than one of those principles in your qualitative data collection. And I would say, because we're typically limited in the time we have in collecting data, that it's very important to think about prioritizing your questions and even doing more work to figure out, if I only have a limited amount of time with a particular stakeholder, what topics of inquiry do I want to be sure to address? And does everyone on the team have the same understanding of those priorities? This just gives you an example of operationalizing your framework, in this case, the REAIM framework, according to your interview questions across different groups of stakeholders. What Jody Haltrup and colleagues did with this particular approach was to look at each aspect of REAIM and ask qualitative questions. And so we took that and lined up our questions with those qualitative questions recommended in that paper. This is just one example of how one might use the constructs and domains in a framework to help think about, well, how would I actually ask a question about this? And that then takes the shape of your interview guide. Much more to say on this topic, but I wanted to at least give a little bit of flavor of what we think about with our semi-structured data collection effort. Along the same lines, just think briefly about ethnography and the growing use of ethnography and ethnographic methods in D&I research. What's great about ethnography is that it really helps us to get into areas where measurement is not easy and where issues are very multifaceted. And we want to get beyond what's evident and what's apparent and really think about what's under the surface. Observational methods can really help us do that work. And we're probably going to supplement observations with other qualitative and quantitative methods potentially. Ethnography can help us understand problems, document processes. We may use ethnography to identify new trends. This is not an exhaustive list of where ethnography is useful, but some of the areas where it's useful, in particular relevance to D&I research. We developed an approach in the Empower query called periodic reflections, which is an ethnographically informed method designed for implementation evaluation. What we were trying to do with this method was really understand more about change over time than we were able to capture in interviews. We wanted a little bit more of that ethnographic feel for what was going on at site with regard to adaptations that were being made, to the use of different implementation strategies. And so we set up this process of using guided discussions with stakeholders who were intimately involved in implementation, the project team, the site-based staff, people who were really on the ground doing the work of implementation, and conducting these sort of lightly guided discussions using the template that you see on the right. And there's much more information about this in the paper, but it was our effort to infuse our implementation work with ethnography. Finally, I'm going to wrap this up just by thinking really briefly about analyzing qualitative data. Again, a huge topic. So you really want to consider your design and the types of data that you have, how your theory, model, or frameworks are informing your analytic approach, what the purpose of your qualitative data is at different points in time, what resources you have, what products you're gearing toward. And along these lines, we've developed an approach to rapid analysis that's really helped us turn around qualitative results in real time, especially in hybrid type 2 and type 3 study design. Much to think about with analysis, but some resources there. Just to wrap up, in terms of the advancing the use of qualitative methods in D&I research, our white paper that I referenced earlier talks about the need to bring more transparency to what we're doing with our qualitative methods, strengthening our use of rapid assessment methods, and potentially expanding our use of methods into those that have not historically been used as much in implementation, like ethnography, but that are really growing in popularity and relevance. We want to keep thinking about issues of language and terms and push on approaches that help with cross-context comparison and synthesis of qualitative data. In summary, of course, this type of research is really fun. It is messy. It is unpredictable, it is nonlinear, and mixed methods can help us to deal with this complexity. Both D&I research and mixed methods research involve interdisciplinary teams, and they're very much driven by model theories and frameworks. The great news is that we can publish early and often, and I would just suggest making sure that you carve out time for your integrated mixed methods papers, and that we continue to work on defining our terms and concepts in both D&I research and in mixed methods. I want to acknowledge my funding sources and my colleagues, and I thank you very much for your time.